Right, welcome back to the Right Hook here on Newstalk. Time as a child in Cork when the mother told me it was one meal and two collations. It was to be black tea and brown bread in those collations. Austerity was the name of the game in 1950s Ireland. Little did we think we would ever see it again. Well, we have. And to explain it all to me is the columnist with the Irish Times, John Waters. How will we handle austerity? This is really a serious question about the Irish psyche, because Lemass, I was looking at some of the stuff Lemass talked about. It was very prescient, you know. Yeah. Lemass said, you know, if you accept defeat, you actually encourage defeat. And, you know, Lemass would have been there when he changed his country around.
Well, I think that today is a very critical day for that reason as well. It's very interesting that the new government takes over on Ash Wednesday in that context. You know, that we have a new government coming in, because it strikes me that actually we are at a moment when we have a choice now, psychologically, philosophically, to say, do we draw a line in the sand, in the land, whatever we're going to call it, and move on and corral all our rage and resentment and recrimination behind that line and move forward in some kind of hope? Or are we just going to completely repeat the same old songs for another 3 years?
You see, I'm worried, and you as a journalist and me as a journalist in our different ways. I think we should not encourage rage and recrimination because it's a useless emotion.
It's useless.
And are we in agreement there?
I would totally agree with you there, that it blocks us completely.
From doing something real.
And to see for reality for what it is. Because, you know, to go back to this question of austerity and Lent, I mean, sometimes because we've kind of moved past the religious phase and all that, we think we have, we kind of misunderstand this. We think of it as purely, you know, self-flagellation, you know, more self-mortification. But there's a reason for it. It's to remind us of something fundamental. And I'm not talking here about the G word. I'm talking about something that Freud talked about when he tried to define happiness. Somebody asked him, what is happiness? And he said, happiness, okay, if you want to understand what happiness is, put your foot out from under the blankets on a cold night. Leave it there for a minute or two. Then take it back in again. That's happiness. And that's something we've lost. Yeah. Because for the last 20 years, we've got this idea that we can chase happiness in a single direction. We can chase it materially, and that the more of that we'll get, the happier in theory we should be. And in a way, all this recrimination and rage, or a lot of it, is about that. It's about the disappointment that, having sort of decided that that was our direction, that we could no longer go there. And now, what we have to pull the foot back in and realise that actually, you know, happiness is a relative thing. Yeah, you can make happiness out of less. And you can still, because like at the end of the day, George, you know, I'm 5'11" and 3/4. This is my reality, my physical reality. I stand in this. You know, I can be 99% as happy with nothing then I might be 100%
because
happy with...
you see, Lemass in the 50s, like the 50s Ireland were in some respects not as bad as this in a different way, but they were pretty bleak.
They were bleak, but we didn't have the expectations we have now, and the disappointment.
That's the difference.
That is it.
So having anger and recrimination at the expectations swept away, there's no point. We have to get back in a way to, and I have a reason for going back to 1950s, in fact slightly earlier, because I think the Germans are getting a very bad rep at the moment, you know, because Angela has given us such a hard time. But I wonder, you know, if we had been in 1945 Berlin, Cologne or Frankfurt, you know, in which the cities had been levelled, in which the Americans had said they were literally going to bomb them back into the Dark Ages. Yeah. If they had given up at that point, there would be no Germany. So we're not as bad as Germany in 1945. So we're not. So therefore we should rebuild.
We should rebuild, you know, and but maybe it's the very nature of the disaster we've experienced that's causing us to block on this. That we keep thinking, you know, if only those guys hadn't done that, if only that guy hadn't done this, if only this had happened, if only that hadn't happened. You know, and while we're in that moment, we're never going to actually understand that actually from now on, this is the first day of the rest of our lives, and we can build it all again in a better way, fresh with the knowledge of what we've learned here. Because we have surely learned something, that you cannot create a system, an economic system or any other kind of system that will make man happy any happier than he can be out of himself. In other words, you cannot. Our happiness does not depend on the nature of our system, of our politics, of our economy. I mean, these things are important tools in all of that as a society. But we actually have to understand. And I think the discussion we're having, and you go back to your job, my job. We really have a responsibility. We've had 3 years now, and I think we had poor leadership in that time. There was a lack of communication. Right. There was an inability to talk about fundamental things. I mean, and the media didn't help. I mean, every time you had, and you would be as guilty as anybody, every time I turned on the radio for the last 3 years, there was an economist on it. Could we agree that for the next year or something, we wouldn't have economists on the radio? That we would just say, okay, we know your argument now. We know what you say about everything, and we can understand it. Look, everybody in Ireland is an expert in economics now, from having been educated in the crucible of the last 3 years. Could we now bring on maybe a few poets and philosophers?
There's a couple of very interesting texts that come in. What about this one? It's okay for you, George, to not to encourage rage, but you can pay your bills and your mortgage. Stand in the shoes of those who cannot.
Well, no, this is the point, George. I mean, we got to deal with this because the rage will not help. And that argument is being used as a cudgel to stop the argument moving on in a way that could help that person down the road. In other words, the block that's happening now can be freed up if we can actually get over that bullying. Because that is bullying. It's emotional bullying of you and me to stop us talking about fundamental things when other people can say, can you live on €199 a week?
But I was listening to some Vox Pops today somewhere, and people were talking about, well, now what I do is I go to different shops and I go to different supermarkets, and nobody actually said I can't buy a loaf of bread. What they said was they bought a loaf of bread in a different place because they checked the price of it. I mean, that's not a bad discipline for us who for 15 years sort of never counted our change.
That's right, it isn't. And I mean, let's take, the guy who felt that his whole identity for the last 20 years was bound up in a top-of-the-range BMW. I would suggest that guy could be 99% as happy as he is now by having a Fiat 500 for a quarter or sixth of the price, maybe with a kind of a jazzy colour on it and a kind of a copy of John Paul Sartre thrown on the back seat.
Can we close on Lent? Does Lent, the ancient rite of Lent, does it give us any example for the future as to how as a country we handle this?
Well, what I think it gives us is an understanding. I give up things for Lent, not out of any kind of gospel greediness, but because I actually find it useful. Because what I actually discover, for example, if I give up coffee, I have given up coffee in the past. Now, for the first week, 10 days, I'm going through the shakes and the sleeplessness and the headaches. But actually, 10 days, 14 days down the road, I feel much better than I did when I was drinking 5 cups of coffee a day. And that's the point. There is a payoff. So you're not actually going into this for the self-mortification. You're actually saying that in a different currency, if we can use that metaphor, there is a payoff. That it isn't going to come in euros, but it's going to come in a different way.
But so, if this nation goes, it'll be a longer Lent, it'll be a darker Lent, but if the nation views it as Lent and says, here we are, and we're going to come out of this better, we're going to be drinking less coffee or eating less chocolate or whatever.
Well, yeah, but I think we need to get into, and I'm not talking about spirituality or anything like that. That's all bullshit, really, in a way, because we don't understand what those words mean anymore. They've become so corrupted. But what we actually need to understand is that our happiness is actually, we still have our lives.
Yeah.
And there's people suffering. There's no doubt about it. And I don't want to in any way downplay that. But we cannot, people have always suffered.
Yeah, we have to go. But we can but wait. Lent tomorrow. You might tell me what you're giving up. Actually, John Moore's just given me a great idea. As a 25 cup a day man, I'm going to give up coffee tomorrow and see what
cups. Do you know something, George?
I've 6 before breakfast.
If you have 3 cups of coffee a day, I read it once, it's like you're living in a war zone. You might be in Beirut. Now, if you're on 25 cups, you're in the middle of Hiroshima. That's where you are right now.
I'm in the middle of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. John Waters of the Irish Times.
The Right Hook with Nationwide UK Ireland. Protect and grow your savings at nationwideuk.ie. Newstalk 106 to 108.
Hello, Pat.
Hello, George. How are you?
What are you ringing me up about? You want 4 Mayo fellas in cabinet or something, is it?
Well, I'm not originally from Mayo, so
Okay.
that doesn't matter to me. But no, I was just listening to your discussion earlier on about anger, and I do believe that you have to let go anger because it's useless. You use up all your energy and you get nothing done. But you were making the point about Germany made a great recovery after the war, but I just rang in and made the point that they didn't have a whole load of blood-sucking bankers on their back.
No, I mean, it was a it had the weakness that all off-the-cuff remarks have, you know. Yes, they didn't have bank debt, and most importantly, they had the Marshall Plan, which was giving them a truckload of money.
To death. They actually got money at a reasonable interest rate, and they rebuilt their country, while we are having our country destroyed by a penal interest rate on money that we didn't borrow. And these, I call them blood-sucking bankers.
No, absolutely. But the interesting thing's just staying with Germany and that era. We also benefited, because all of Europe benefited from the Marshall Plan. But we actually wasted the money. We actually dug a hole in the ground in the late 40s and early 50s and put the money into it, because we put all the Marshall Plan money into stupid rural and farming schemes.
Yeah, well, that's a different debate.
We're not even good, Pat, when we get free money.
Well, okay, but fair enough. But at the moment, we're not getting free money. We're getting the life and blood sucked out of us, and we didn't borrow the money.
No,
it was other people's gambling debts we're paying for, and we're going to pay for it with our health services, and we're going to pay higher taxes.
But you do agree with John Waters, though, that anger isn't necessarily a useful emotion.
It is absolutely useless because you use up all your energy and you achieve nothing. But I do believe that you must focus on what the problem is. And the first problem is you have to get the monkeys off your back.
All right, okay. Thanks so much for calling me.
Thank you,
that was Pat there calling me from Mayo.
The Right Hook with Nationwide UK Ireland. Protect and grow your savings at nationwideuk.ie. Newstalk 106 to 108.